Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to get started. I'm Elliot Levine, Research Director at the Aurora Institute, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. It's part of a series of more than 20 webinars we're offering this fall on important issues related to competency-based education. And there are several coming up, and also many that have already happened that are available on our website. You can access all of them through the link that we're putting here in the chat box. The webinar series is a prologue to our annual Aurora Institute Symposium, which we're offering virtually this year on October 26th through 28th, starting 2 weeks from today. So we hope you'll join us and visit our website for more information about that as well. We're also putting a link to our symposium website in the chat box. During today's webinar, we encourage you to use the chat box to help us get to know you and get to know each other and to learn from each other. You could start by introducing yourself in the chat box, and please feel free to use it anytime to ask questions, to answer other people's questions, to share resources that you think others would find useful, relevant to the conversation we're having today. You could also share your thoughts about the webinar with other people in the field or whatever you're learning from the event using hashtag Aurora 2020 on Twitter, or our handle, which is shown here. And last of all, we'll be recording and archiving the webinar. You'll be getting an email within a couple days letting you know how to access that and all of the other archived webinars on our website. The webinar series that I mentioned includes 10 webinars that have a substantial research component focused on building the evidence base for personalized learning and competency-based education. As part of that series, we're very fortunate to be joined today by 3 leaders in higher education and K-12 education, and they'll be sharing their findings from a study of K-12 leaders who are leading change to student-centered learning in their schools and districts, with the goal of helping us understand some of the key strategies and challenges and resources needed for successful implementation of student-centered learning. Professor Heather Williams is joining us from Boise State University. Principal Donnell McNeil is joining us from Central Academy High School in Meridian, Idaho. And Principal Jen Wright is joining us from Notice Elementary School in Notice, Idaho. So thank you all so much for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to Heather Williams to get us started. Thanks, Heather.
Thank you, Elliot. We're excited to be here today, and we're excited that we get to talk to you a little bit about what we've learned and share our story out here in Idaho. If you want to go to the next slide, we'll give you a little bit of background. We thought that it would be important to give you some context. And so I'm honored today to have 2 of my graduate students with me. Donnell and Jen are both graduate students. I'm primarily faculty here at Boise State. I'm a program coordinator for executive ed leadership in the College of Education. Prior to that, though, I spent over 20 years in K-12. So I think when I think about studying student-centered learning initiatives, I have to go back quite a ways. I started about 20 years ago in my high school classroom when I was teaching biology. And back then we called it layered curriculum. I don't know if any of you taught that way. I remember having to explain it to my principal a lot, and to teachers, occasionally to the school board. But I always thought that students deserved to have some choice and some voice in their learning. And some students needed more time and some students needed less time. And over the years, I went on to work in administration and served as a superintendent. And what I realized is that often the system wasn't aligned for students to be successful. And so I spent most of my time as a researcher and a student of systems leadership. And that's what I do now in higher education, is study systems leadership and policy implementation. And that's really how I got into this work. I've had the good fortune, I see my friend Erin McKinnon is on the call today. I've had the good fortune of working with the Idaho State Department of Education, and I see his predecessor, Marita Diffenbaugh, is also on the call today. She was also very active in this work. I've worked with the State Department and been a partner in the Idaho Mastery Education Network. And we're going to talk a little bit about what we learned from that effort. And specifically, you know, I know in my heart that it takes leadership at all levels, from the policy arena to the student in the classroom, for student-centered learning to really be realized in the system. However, leaders and the ones we're going to talk about today, building principals, superintendents, they're crucial for the alignment of resources, for the sense making, for energizing, securing resources, and really creating ownership of the work. I'm interested in understanding their stories, in telling their stories, and in helping others hear and understand what it takes to implement policies. And so that's really what my interest is. And so without further ado, I want you to meet a couple of these amazing leaders that I've had the opportunity to work with. And so Donnell, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Williams. My name is Donnell McNeil. I'm the principal at Central Academy High School in West Ada School District. West Ada School District is the largest school district in the state of Idaho, about 40,000 students. We are an alternative high school. Typically, students come to us who've struggled with attendance, grades, social emotional development issues, or what have you. We have roughly about 150 students. And, you know, over the past 5 years, we've kind of gone on this journey towards mastery. It started out when our former superintendent, Dr. Linda Clark, was trying to get some of the race to the top grant monies. And a part of that grant application with the consortium of schools and our districts around the country, she chose to implement competency-based education. We did not get those monies, did not get the grant, but she still felt like in meeting that need of trying to address how to help low-performing schools in the district, that competency-based education made sense for the alternative schools, and that's kind of where the journey began. I didn't know much about competency-based or mastery-based education, and have come to be a champion for my belief, my deep belief, which is really the answer to the question regarding equity in schools. We started to take some trips. The first trip, we went to Salt Lake City, saw Innovations High School. Principal at the time was Ken Grover, and really set the stage. We then took trips to Northern California and Bronx Arena High School in New York. I think one of the most powerful things for me along the way was being able to go to Northern California. We spent time at Summit Schools and at Leadership Public Schools. And, you know, for me, the biggest takeaway from that time was two-part. One was the culture of the schools and really being able to allow those students to feel like they were human beings first and foremost, not just the moniker of student. And then number two, the second part is we took a trip to Google, and it really shifted my thinking as far as what are we preparing students to be able to do once they leave high school. My ultimate why, and the reason why I do the work that I do is all centered around equity. I do believe that all means all. And so I believe that we need to create structures. And for us, we've seen great gains in the mastery movement, and we would like to continue the dialogue you know, along that journey and continue to tell our story so that others can feel empowered especially those individuals, those young people who live in some of the toughest communities around our country. So thank you for having me.
Hi, good morning. I would like to say it's an honor and privilege to work with this team and to the work that we've been working on for the last 6 years. And so I landed out here in Notice. I was a principal in another district and then joined Notice 6 years ago, and it's a rural community. So we have 400 students, 200 elementary students, and literally across the street is our junior senior high with about 200 students. So 6 miles from the interstate. We are considered a rural community, but it's closer to Caldwell and Boise than people give us credit for. And so I think the reason why I joined part of this work is because when I first joined Notice, our students were 2 to 3 grade levels behind. The teachers were discouraged, but they were quality instructors willing to do the work, and our students just needed to be reminded that they can be champions of their own learning. So being part of this network, the grant came across, I was like, this would be awesome to learn with colleagues and to be part of this work, but then also to have some support from other teachers. And then I also was able to participate in some of the school observations and going to visit other schools and see the innovation that was happening across the nation. And so I was like, well, we can bring that back to small town Notice. And so that's, we were able to bring some of that back. And so I really feel like our mantra here is quality instruction happening every day in every classroom, but now we can add on, with student ownership. And so that's really been, my why of this work. I consider myself a learner, and so this is hard work, but I think it's very achievable. And so I'm looking forward to seeing what next steps happen. So thank you again for this opportunity.
I'm going to go to the next slide. So a little bit of background to what we actually did. The data is based on a survey that was given to district and school leaders in Idaho in January through March of 2019. And it was aimed at exploring their perceptions of how leading the implementation of student-centered learning initiatives, and in Idaho that's known as mastery education. But these state level policies, how leading the implementation of these policies had really changed their leadership role or their day-to-day work, and what supports or resources that principals, superintendents, and district level leaders felt like were most needed for successful policy implementation. Next slide.
So to give some of the history, in the very beginning, we had Governor Otter, and he created this task force to improve our K-12 education system. So that's where this all started. And then House Bill 110, and then we were able to be part of this IMN grant network funded with the State Department. So those are those incubator sites that Donnell and my own school, we were part of that work, continuing to be part of this work, and just really learning from each other. I always say it's messy work because it does not fit in the box, and there's, we're still working on what it looks like in that systematic approach. And then currently, super excited, meeting with Erin this morning, about 100 schools and 34 districts are actively part of the IMN network. However, I really want to iterate, there are other schools and districts that are doing this work because it's working. So that's the history of this work.
Next slide. So in terms of the actual study, we had 51 participants that completed our survey. And here's kind of an overview of what that looked like. The majority of our participants were building administrators, and they were evenly distributed between, we had an elementary perspective and a secondary perspective. We did have some district administration as well. And then the majority of them had been serving in their current position, so their current school, for 2 to 5 years. And in terms of how long they had been implementing mastery or student-centered learning, and just to give you some background there, I mean, I know In our state, there is some discussion about what is mastery, what is student-centered learning, and so we allowed people to talk about what they were doing and allowed for discussion of that. So that's why it's a little bit more open-ended. The majority, though, had been at implementation 2 or more years. There was a third of the population that was exploring the concept for the future. So at this time when the data was collected, IMIN, or the Idaho Mastery Education Network, still had a cap, and so it was limited in terms of participation. Only those schools that had been allowed in the beginning were able to participate. And so some schools were implementing student-centered learning initiatives or mastery competency-based education on their own. Others were waiting for the state to remove the cap and were wanting to get in future years like they have now. So that's kind of a little bit of background on who participated in the study. If you want to go to the next slide. And then these are the 2 questions that we really wanted to get at. Do school leaders perceive that the implementation of the student-centered learning policies, and so we had a state level policy that allowed for mastery education. So do school leaders perceive the implementation of this policy and or the related practices change their role and or responsibilities, and if so, how? And then what resources or support do they need to implement the policy? I'm going to go to the next slide.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how the implementation changed the work of our leaders with students, teachers, parents, and school board and community stakeholders. Obviously, one of the biggest things was for the student and the school relationship. One of the first things that we had to really kind of dive into was really shifting the mindset of our students from buy-in to ownership. At our school right now, you know, we don't use the buy-in term. We really believe buy-in is something where you show up, you get a choice or not, whereas ownership should be something that you should do regardless. If you feel comfortable in the situation, sometimes you don't like a teacher because of personality or whatever it may be, that you can still take ownership over that which is yours. The other piece, as far as, you know, what changed for our work with students, was we realized that they did not have the independent skills and dispositions to be able to be resilient in the face of adversity. For our students, that was a time when a lot of the behaviors kind of started to rise. And that was also a time where the communication and the relationship between us and them really started to dwindle. And we really felt like if we were going to build these human beings to be able to transition from our learning environment and apply those skills to life, that it was extremely important that we were deliberate, intentional, and strategic regarding teaching those skills and dispositions to be resilient. Another thing that kind of changed for us was, you know, we got rid of a lot of the traditional consequences and discipline structures, and like many of your schools, or for many of you, we implemented restorative practices. But it wasn't purely meant for the discipline aspect. It was really meant to redefine or define the relational interactions of our students and our staff members. We really believe that, especially in 2020, as we've all experienced, agreeing to disagree is a skill. And so we use restorative practices to be able to kind of engage in that work. The other piece, as far as the agency is concerned, we really felt like that there was power in meeting students where they were at. You know, I always use the example of a lot of times kids come into the 9th grade, and whether they had a 1.0 GPA or a 4.0 GPA, we typically put them in the same class and we start them on the same lesson, even though all of the data suggests that those students are at completely different places. And we believe that that puts a lot of pressure on students to either try to navigate the system, or for those higher performing students, we feel like we're missing meeting their needs as well. The other piece that changed for me in particular, and for a lot of the leaders who are my friends around the state, is we really had to build this culture of unconditional love. You know, for us, what we believe is that regardless of the mistakes that they make as young people, that we really still want them to know that being a human being, we all make mistakes, and we all have a fresh start and a new opportunity every day to be able to do something different, because the ultimate mastery is not mastery of content. The ultimate mastery in our eyes is mastery of self. For our teachers, you know, that it was big shifts for them as well. And one of the biggest shifts was really helping them to understand that it wasn't about the moniker of teacher versus student. It was really about two human beings interacting, trying to get their needs met, and having a common goal. You know, there were some big ahas for us at first, which was that our teachers were not natural mentors. And, you know, a lot of them could come into our system, they could teach our students content, they could follow a schedule, they could teach them protocols and procedures. But as far as being able to really diagnose where a kid was at emotionally, even mentally at times, or where they were at as far as skill development is concerned, that was a struggle for them. And so explicit skill instruction was something that we had to really dive into, and it's work that is ongoing. It's an ongoing dialogue and a part of all of our PLCs and the professional development in our building. I'd also say the other thing that was a big aha, you know, I say this a lot, which is these young people are a part of a watching generation. I think the stat was like there's 80 million or billion or whatever hours of YouTube watched on a daily basis. And so engagement from our teachers and them modeling those expected behaviors, these young people are watching them move, and we have a responsibility to engage them and an obligation to engage them on a daily basis. As far as our parents are concerned, you know, this was probably one of the hardest hurdles for them, because our school is so different in how we interact, that for many of them as an alternative school, their school experiences were really poor. And so they don't love school, their kids know they don't love school. And so it was difficult to kind of engage them with this new way of things. But the aha moment for me was when I talked about it, and then they would start to say, man, I wish I had a school like that when I was young, because I believe that my outcome in life would have been different. So, and I think the other piece is that we have a mentor system that I'll talk a little about in a minute, but you know, the communication between the parent and the school and that kid's biggest advocate, you know, we really had to transform that. You know, I say it a lot is that if our parents don't believe in what we do, then their kid won't be successful in our school. And also at a traditional school, you can not like what the school does at all, and your kid can still walk out of there with a 4.0. So there's an expectation that we are aligned. And then lastly, I would say with the school board and the community stakeholders, what really changed for me is that prior to that, I didn't really know a lot of the board members or the local legislators or what have you, and they became a part of our world. They visit our school a ton, and really engaging them in the dialogue, because there's a specific population that we're trying to address here at our school. In the state of Idaho, we're extremely conservative state, and so, you know, policy guides a lot of how these human beings interact. And so being able to kind of, you know, take some of that anecdotal data, but also make sure that as far as the data is concerned, that they are seeing the student achievement continue to improve and increase for our students is a necessity. And so I think more than anything, that partnership and the opportunities we've had to be able to speak to these legislators, whether it's the House Ed Committee or the Senate Education Committee, they are definitely listening, because I think that at the end of the day, they really do want to do what's best for our students. Next slide.
So overall, 40% of leaders said that they had to significantly change their leadership style to better lead the implementation of student-centered learning policies. And we put up a few quotes that really captured the essence of leaders. And I'll let Jen speak first on this slide of her experience from Notice.
Yeah, so I feel like I've grown as a leader, especially over the last 6 years. With this work, we really, like Donnell mentioned, that mindset and mindfulness is key. I had to take a step back and look at where we're headed and really think about where we want to be in 2 years, where we want to be in 5 years, and then not go too fast. Really taking one bite at a time, because it can be overwhelming. But I think if we really think about the changes we want to make and then how we're going to be there and get there. And so it did make me more assertive as a leader, that sense of urgency, because once things started rolling, it was like magic. It really, the pieces started to fit together. And I agree. We were also kind of under that, not microscope by state leaders, but, very curious of what's happening in our schools and how is it working among the different districts. And so I also felt like I needed to make sure that we were being very transparent with the work that we were doing, but then also supporting, getting support from our school board and with the State Department. So those are my 2 cents on this one.
Yeah, I would make just 2 quick points. I'd say the first one is the shift in my thinking, and Jim mentioned it, which is thinking of teachers as learners, and not necessarily first and foremost, like we a lot of times say, as professionals. To me was where the work really started to transition. Obviously, teachers had to be extremely vulnerable, with that kind of shift, but I think thinking of them as learners was huge. It made me, obviously, as a leader, more responsive and more conscious of what I was modeling to them. And then also, I think there's that last statement there that says that we didn't know what we didn't know, really was kind of like built this curiosity about learning and really transforming the system. And so we really try to infuse our culture with that idea that that's okay. And I think that normalcy of some of these concepts, building that into school culture as human beings working together, completely transformed my leadership style.
Okay, the next slide. 71% of our leaders indicated that their thinking about teaching and learning had changed either a moderate amount to a great deal. And so Donnell kind of indicated this in his last comments, but I want him to continue to build on that and dig a little deeper. And I'm gonna pick on Donnell for a minute, but dig a little deeper into that, because really the majority of leaders really had to change their thinking about teaching and learning a great deal.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that happened for us was when we decided to take state standards, which, I think we all can agree there's way too many of them to be able to get through in a K-12 career for a student. We really needed to be able to unpack those and really prioritize, what was important. Some people struggle with that. But what I found was our teachers really didn't know the standards at their core anyways, because what they knew about them were probably more similar to I can statements or to our competencies. When we ended up adopting those competencies, that was another moment where we found out what they did and did not know. But as they've been able to take control, ownership of this more manageable set of competencies, now they're able to align these skill opportunities, these learning opportunities for our students that allow that explicit skill instruction to be able to be more seamless. So for us, that skill development and that transition from content to skill development for our teachers took some time, but it's the greatest aha moment I'd probably say that we've experienced for our teachers and as a staff collectively. And it's the reason why we believe that we are continuing to trend upward in all of our student achievement data.
And I'll piggyback off of that. I also think grading, you know, so as an elementary, and then we also worked on this as a K-12 system, is separating out work habits with the grades. And so that was a shift in that teaching. Well, I've always graded it this way. Well, are they showing their evidence of learning, or how are they showing the evidence of learning? So that flexibility had to be there. And then of course there's the system pieces of what does our report card look like? Or I'm a second grade teacher and I've always taught this Apple unit. Well, let's think about what does that unit look like? And then how are the students taking ownership of that learning? So I agree, even at the elementary level, the competency work was also a game changer, because that made the umbrella to help us figure out how we were going to show the evidence of learning. It is a lot of work in the beginning, a lot of front loading, but the outcomes make it worth it. And so, yeah, I would agree the competency was a key point too.
We finally got our first question in the chat box. I'm so excited. Can you both see that, Donnell and Jen? What is your measure of proficient or mastery?
So what we use is our competencies have what we call performance level descriptors, and each content area has a set of competencies and there's usually probably, I don't know, 8 to 12 of them individually. And then what happens is it's a rubric, and those rubrics are synonymous with grade levels. So we go from 2 to 12. Our goal for our students is for them to hit a 10, and a 10 is indicative of the community college level for our students. And remember, we're an alternative school, so these kids have a ton of gaps in learning. So a level 10 is great. If they hit a level 12 in our school, which we do have some kids who do hit that mark, that means that they could go to a 4-year university.
And at the elementary level, we also have them in bands. So we have a K2 band and a 3-5 band and a 6-8 band. And so that was some communication that we needed to work with our parents of. In our level system is a level system of 1 through 4. And so we had to take a step back, share with our parents, share with our students, and what does that mean? Because with the bands, they could dance, you know, either or, but it really showed, it met the students where they were, and then we were able to set goals with their data binders and their learning plans. And then I'll answer the question about Wilder. Absolutely. So Wilder is about 20 minutes from here, and they're actually Wilder, Idaho is part of our consortium. So Notice is part of a consortium with 5 total districts. And so we have visited out there to their school. That's a great question.
Yeah, and Wilder is also part of IMN, and they have been from the beginning as well. So they have also shared in the work. Next slide. So this slide's very interesting. 57% of our leaders indicated that the basic structure of their school day and schedule involved changing to a non-traditional structure where classes incorporated flexibility in both pace and place of learning for students to demonstrate competency.
I can start. Yep.
Jen, go ahead.
I just wanted to share, this is a safe space for us to start with flexible seating and flexible schedule. I'm always, every quarter, the teachers are like, are we going to change the schedule, or we need to change the schedule, or let's look at the schedule. And so I really think the schedule flexibility is what has helped us be successful with this hybrid schedule during COVID. But this was a safe space to start, especially some of those teachers that were a little hesitant of mastery learning and what does that look like. But we did some work with flexible seating as a picture of our first graders last year. So I think if you were thinking, where do I start as a leader or as a school, this would be a good space to start. And then I'll turn it over to Donnell.
Yeah, for us, early on, I'm a little crazy at times, I've been told, but we changed our schedule pretty much every semester, because I think that one of the things about education is we make assumptions about what the schedule does. And so we started changing it, and we're probably more now closer to more of a traditional schedule. But the first thing that we did was we got rid of the bells. And so we shut off all the bells because we really believe that kids could look at a clock and be able to transition, and that our teachers could end a learning opportunity and say, now it's time to transition, and that we didn't need some bell doing that. And so that's just some of the small shifts in thinking. But I would say that a lot of the dialogue that we had, the rich dialogue, was centered around the schedule and how to group students and how to have them transition into a learning space to be able to respond accordingly.
Yeah, there's some questions in the chat box, and I did say this one was interesting. I mean, it seems fairly certain that the schedule would change, but the follow-up and discussion is what's interesting. So can you talk about the challenges you faced with changing the schedule and parent community logistics and some of the perceptions that surround that? Do either one of you want to address that?
At the elementary, it was just about being transparent with communication. We're part of this. This is why we're doing this, and this is what it looks like, and just kind of rolling up our sleeves and getting the work done. We did change our schedule quite a bit as well. We created some walk to learn, where students were able to walk to their space of learning, whether that's project-based learning or some enrichment or filling in some gaps with phonics instruction or whatever that may look like. Very, very fluid. So I think just being very transparent with the communication schedule, but I get it. The secondary schedule is tricky. So I'll let Donnell share about that.
Yeah, you know, our parent community for us, because we're an alternative school, a lot of our parents are just busy. And so some of them, you know, they just care that their kids are cared about when they come to school. But there were some pushback. But I think that when you really understand your why, and your school community is not purely built on policies, I guess you could say, or the way people interact, not purely built on policies, it makes it a little easier for people to feel like you're being flexible. When we changed, there was times where, to be honest with you, certain kids who were doing well in one schedule weren't doing as well, I guess you could say, in the next. And we really just presented that to them as, man, life is really about, you know, being able to be faced with adversities and being able to allow us to be able to really be alternative. Our alternative schools were very similar to traditional schools. So people supported the overall vision, and really jumped on the bandwagon as far as that is concerned. But yes, definitely difficult, a lot of feedback.
Next slide. We will come back to some of the questions, but we want to get through some of the content before we run out of time.
Okay, so this is, I guess I'm still talking a little bit about the stories from my vantage point, or our vantage point. You know, over time, you know, I've been able to kind of gather all these different quotes about, like, reflections about what we are as a system. And, you know, one of the quotes that I say to people a lot is that, you know, I've realized that in society that we don't have a common set of beliefs, morals, or values. And that definitely, you know, challenged the work of schools on a daily basis regarding, are we doing what's best for our students? And so we show up every day knowing that, and really being able to get kids to be able to define that for themselves, and our families to define that. But we understand that the flexibility definitely allows for students, that acknowledging that allows for students to show up and be more successful, and being able to accept the feedback and being able to build on those skills. I'd also say, you know, as far as the change process is concerned, this is definitely second order change. When we started to strip away some of those traditional teacher behaviors, you know, they started to feel like there was this lack of, like, confidence and competence and this consciousness for them. And, you know, so we do a lot to be able to really try to celebrate who they are and celebrate growth. I would say that that's another word that's synonymous with mastery, competency-based, and everything that we do is we have different measures for growth. And so we celebrate that more than anything. It's more about the journey than just the destination. And then I'd say for our students, some of the challenges that we're faced were, they're just overall emotional intelligence. And I think we're seeing this in society as a whole. And so we're very deliberate about that. And like I said earlier, you know, the ultimate mastery to me is mastery of self. I think the scheduling piece is just so, it's just so interesting to me. I remember when we first started out, I asked our students to create their own schedules. So they showed up on the first day, they had to create their own schedules. They had this like menu of options, and they can go to English in the morning if they wanted to, and they struggled. And I remember a kid standing at the board looking, you know, kind of, she was struggling with figuring out where to go. And he said to me, he said, Mr. McNeil, he said, the hardest thing is that we've been in a system where they've told us where to go, and now you're giving us freedom to choose, and that's difficult. So I think the changes impact the kids too, but they definitely become empowerment. And then I would just say, as far as the student achievement data, you know, I think one of the hardest things that we embraced early on was that we can build a culture where kids feel loved and cared about and all that great stuff. But there's some people, you know, at the state level, even at the district level, who really want to see is the student achievement happening as well. And so for us, in 2020, this past May, we had our largest graduating class in the last 5 years. We bumped our graduation rate, you know, 40%. And also, we don't, it's, the SBAC version is called the ISAT in Idaho. And so, you know, more than half of our students are reaching proficiency as far as that is concerned, which, you know, traditionally that number was closer to 0 for alternative schools. And then the other piece that we're really proud about is we have this rich, diverse staff, and our retention of our teachers is purpose-driven, there's clarity, and I know that every day when they show up, that they know that they have an opportunity to connect with the kids, not just based on a schedule, but based on who they are internally.
Next slide. So moving on to the next research question, we really want to look at the resources leaders said they most needed. Next slide. So when we think about students and parents, kind of 3 things stood out. When it comes to students, we need a map for the path of change. You know, we really need a big map, not just for our school or not just for the student, but the system map. And we need to think about the training. Leaders said they need training for them, they need training for students to take ownership for the learning. And then they need a toolkit, or they need help in communicating the why. They need resources and tools to be able to communicate to parents the theory behind mastery education and student-centered learning, as well as resources in the implementation efforts. And I'll let Jen talk first on this slide in her experience at Notice.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with communicating the why, from the state board to your parents, your teachers, but then also your students. Like, our next part of this journey is we're going to have mastery ed experiences with our students with project-based learning. And so when I was starting to plan that, I was like, oh, I got to go back up and talk about the why of why we're doing this with our projects, and then sharing with our community the work that we're doing. So I would say start there. And then also I think a synonymous word for training would be empowering students to take ownership for their learning. I truly believe all the way down to those kindergartners, when they have their data binder and they're sharing where they were and where they're headed, and then they have their goals and their learning plans. And so that's been super exciting for us at the elementary level.
Yeah, I know we're running a little short on time, but I just wanted to kind of talk about the training students to take ownership for learning. I think one of the things that we have to be careful about is this when it comes to research is, you know, a few considerations are, what is the language that we're using to present our families and our students with an opportunity to see things differently and to see this kind of best version of themselves. When I think about some of our students who live in poverty, when I think about many of our families are single parent, come from single parent homes. When I think about our Black and Brown students and the struggle that we're having. If you just look at the data across the country, you know, those students are struggling. And so I think that we need to understand that many decisions for these people are survival, they're not strategic. And so it's really important for schools to be able to engage them in a way that we're partnering with them, and that we're also saying to them, like, man, we want to build your capacity so that you can help support the best version of your kid at the end of the day as well.
Next slide. When we think about what do leaders need in terms of resources when they're working with their teachers and the overall system, 74% of leaders said that they needed tools to better prepare teachers for the shift. And one of the areas was really in creating meaningful and positive assessments for student learning. And that was closely followed by helping teachers establish measurable learning skills for students. And then the other area is really helping with clear alignment with district expectations. So 90% of leaders surveyed acknowledged that they needed to continually make sure what they were doing was in alignment with their governance, their school board goals and expectations, and that was highly relevant to their success. Donnell, you want to start on this slide?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I talk about the, you know, staff members or teachers really shifting to becoming a learner, I believe that this is where that happened. And it was where we asked our teachers to be vulnerable. I think one of the most difficult things or considerations that we had in our professional development is really helping teachers to understand themselves as designers, and really tapping into their creative nature. And then helping them to be okay with this idea of revision, where they would bring me a performance assessment. I would take a look at it. I, you know, read it up, and then I give it back to them. The same thing that they do for students really created a lot of angst in many of them, and that is where they started to feel incompetent. So I think that being able to model learning with our teachers was huge. And then also just the feedback. In a mastery competency-based model, feedback is central to everything that we do, and it's where our clarity lies, and it's where our students are able to propel themselves. And so teachers being able to be okay with feedback, not necessarily just based on our evaluation or observation tool or model, was huge. And so, yeah, this was the most empowering part as far as the support for creating meaningful performance assessments.
And I would add to that, also giving time for teachers to calibrate and to establish what does the 4 look like, what does the 3 look like, and then also giving them time to learn with each other, and then look at those. Since we were in bands, we really work as a grade level band, but also thinking about that system all the way up to 12th grade. And so I think just making sure they have time to collaborate and get the work on the work together.
Next slide.
So some stories, I really just want to reiterate, just making sure we provide that safe space, not only to fill in those academic holes, but those social emotional holes, or the demographics, or the poverty, or, you know, even what students are walking in with, and removing those barriers, and just making sure that we can really, I love what Donnell said about the mastery of self. I'm totally stealing that. And so I just think it's just making sure that we really provide an avenue to provide equity to learning. And what does that look like? It looks different in every classroom here, in every learning space. However, we all have the same goal in mind. And so that would be kind of my story for Notice.
Next slide. And for us, you know, if you look at that work of John Hattie and visible learning, the importance of collective teacher efficacy. You know, here's an example on that top left picture is our staff huddle. We don't do a lot of whole staff meetings anymore. We do 15-minute huddles to say, hey, this is what's important, to celebrate each other, to talk about the learning intention of our professional learning communities on a weekly basis. And then we highlight, you know, the success of our students during that time. That's been really powerful for us. I talked a little bit about that buy-in versus ownership. Jen talked a little bit about the social emotional learning. We use a set of habits of success. And so all of our students have mentors. So half of our staff are content specialists or you know, your more traditional teachers. The other half of our staff are mentors, and they really manage all of the social emotional learning, the organization, the non-academic skills, those soft skills. Huge returns on investment with making that decision. And then also, you know, what we realize is that our teachers, they've been able to develop many of these strategies and identify, hey, well, what is best in this environment? So this summer we took on some of the work and we addressed these things here, which was ownership of competencies, student-teacher conferencing, and really coming up with an agenda and a guide for when you sit down with the student, what is it that you're saying? Flexible grouping, which is huge when students are all moving at their own pace. And then also one of the biggest things, which is what's our workflow to be able to address those gaps in learning, and that responsiveness, and what should students expect from us as far as the dialogue and the conversation. Next slide.
I will address the question in the chat box. So currently in Notice, we are a hybrid schedule. So we are working in person and teaching in person. And so the students come 2 days a week, and then 2 days they're working independently on learning plans. And I feel like the work that we have done the last couple of years has really prepared our students to advocate for themselves, to work, do the work, and then, you know, able to ask questions when they come back, and then really hit that mark to make sure that they're working independently at home on their 2 days. So yep, we're still open, thankfully.
Yeah, and we're still open as well, and hybrid model, and like Jen said, with the work we've done has prepared us for this moment. And you know, we really try to take the positive with anything. So you know, the situation with COVID and students working from home, yeah, we would love for them to be here with our teachers, but you know, many jobs are remote jobs in 2020, and so we really feel like we're preparing our students to potentially be able to have that skill set once they leave our school as well. So we believe it's a lot about just how you frame it and how you tell the story and the messaging behind it.
So just to summarize really quickly, so like I mentioned before, what we've learned, I really feel like this structure and framework and the practices has really helped close the gap. And so when you hear about a gap, you typically think about academic gap, but I want to encompass social emotional gap, demographic gap, and then the academic gap.
And then what I would just say is that in that second kind of bullet there, the celebrate and documenting your journey, this is probably one of the things that I've told people is just take pictures of the things that are happening, write that blog, you know, organize those files, start to tell your story about this shift, because, you know, we tell our adults, or I tell our staff members that, you know, they are pioneers in this movement to really be able to define equity for all students. And so documenting your journey and celebrations, like that's a part of our culture, and it doesn't have to always be a big thing. Sometimes it's just a really small thing, but the people who show up to our school, what they say is we have a very rich, tangible culture.
Yeah, we would add that the work is messy and it takes time and resilience and some grace to get through the work. When we think about future research, we know there's a lot of questions that still need to be answered, and we're curious if there's certain frameworks that are yielding better results for the overall system than others. You know, in Idaho, we're a local control state, and I like to say, you know, we like to see 1,000 flowers bloom. And so what's the role of a framework? You know, what's the role of balancing local control with state or federal guidelines or guidance. And even at the district, you know, in Donnell's district, he's in a large district. There's a lot of local control at the building level. And so how does that work, and what's the best approach? We still have a lot of study to do there. The role of families, Donnell touched on it a little bit. You know, we have a lot of study to do there as well in terms of equity and closing the gap for all students, and what are we actually getting accomplished there. And then our ability to quantify change to continue to garner stakeholder support. And so we're excited about the learning to date. I think there's maybe a time for one question. Are the students' grade levels fluid since they are attaining levels 2 through 12? Jen and Donnell, do you want to talk about grade levels?
Yeah, and at the elementary level, since we're a small school, we have grade level teams. So there's some fluidity in the 4 to 5 bands and 1, 2, just depends on, because you still have some systems pieces in the sense of how many students per, with your FTE, with your teachers. And so each year looks different. It also is based on the need of the students. And so I wouldn't say, sometimes you'll see you'll hear through the grapevine of, oh, there's no grades at that school. Well, we're not there, but I could say each student knows where they're at with their competency and their evidence of learning. So that's the elementary answer. Donnell, you want to? And then on the competencies, we did work with Redesign's work, but we also used Marzano's, and then we kind of meshed them together. And how long did the process take? I would say it's still a working document. We're still polishing it up after every reporting. And I think the reason is because I don't want it to be a notebook on the shelf. It's something that we're still working on.
For us, grades are partly fluid because we have to answer to our state, and our graduation rate in our state is based off of a cohort model. So they have to have grade levels, but as far as the students' learning experiences, a student could come in as a junior, have no high school English credits, and we expect them to be able to perform at the lowest level regarding we have a portfolio system. So instead of grade levels, it's more portfolio based. And once they reach that lowest level in that portfolio or demonstrate growth, then they move on to the next portfolio. So yes, as far as the learning experiences, yes, very fluid. Feel like that's like non-negotiable in a competency mastery-based environment, and it's what I believe will allow us to see it work at the secondary level.
Yeah, next slides, Elliot.
And this right here, last week was a long week for me for a lot of different reasons, but I try to find inspiration from those close to me. And so Jen and Dr. Williams and Heather, when we're spending time trying to talk about, this whole thing and this webinar, I came up with this reflection, which is to truly achieve equity in schools. There's an expectation, obligation, and requirement for educators to possess extremely high levels of personal, emotional, and professional endurance for those who struggle, to strive for the aforementioned belief statement. They're truly fighting for a teacher-centered learning environment that respectfully belongs in society's prior era.
Elliot, we'll turn it back over to you.
Oh, and here's their contact information while I'm saying a couple of wrap-up comments. First of all, Heather, Donnell, and Jen, thank you so much. The research you're doing is so important for the field, and we really need the inspiration of hearing the work that's happening in Idaho, as well as all of the information you're providing about what leaders are experiencing, what students, families, school boards, and everybody involved is experiencing. So thank you. This is really valuable and important. I saw the question from Oh, right, about the paper. Yeah, we're really looking forward to seeing. I know there's so much more coming out of this because you've done all these surveys and analyses. So yeah, we're really excited to see what comes out of that. I wanted to ask everyone who participated today. We really appreciate you being with us, and it would be super helpful if you could spend 1 minute answering this 3-question survey. The link is the link in the chat box. Hopefully it will be any second. And if you could answer the survey, we would really appreciate it. While you're finishing up the survey, no, the link's still not there. Oh, there it is. Okay, great. While you're finishing up the survey, I just wanted to point out that this webinar series has 7 more webinars remaining on a variety of topics to advance your work in competency-based education, such as high school internships, students' use of flex time, and performance assessments using proficiency scales and other topics. We have many other webinars in this series that are archived and available on our website. So we encourage you to go there, and that link is also now in the chat box. We have our symposium coming up, as I mentioned, October 26th to 28th. We really hope you'll join us. That link is also in the chat box, and there's lots of information about the 3 days of sessions with the presenters and all of the information. So we're really excited about that coming up and look forward to seeing you there. And last of all, wanted to ask, we'd love to have you stay connected. Here's some of our contact information. And last of all, please join me again in thanking our presenters from Boise State University and schools in Idaho. We really appreciate the work you're doing, and we know how busy you are with this very complicated school year. So thank you so much for your time and sharing your findings, your learning with us today. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon. So thank you very much, and take care, everybody.